Welcome to everybody for joining today's webinar. We are going to be presenting from Getting Hired and the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, and today's webinar is going to be on tips to understanding multiple sclerosis within the workplace. I wanted to thank everybody again for joining today's webinar. This is packed with information and an interactive webinar as well. So you should be able to select a chat box from the WebEx, and we will be asking questions throughout the webinar. Also, please know that you can ask questions throughout the webinar, and those will be sent to me directly. So we will try to call those out throughout the presentation if we have time. If not, and if we run out of time at the end, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar as well. But just another housekeeping item, everyone's line will automatically be placed on mute at the very end of the presentation. We will have time for questions, so we'll give everybody an opportunity to ask those directly and unmute yourselves if you would like. But without further ado, I would really like to welcome Steve from the MS Society, who's going to be presenting today. Steve, if you would like to give us all a brief introduction, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks so much for letting me be a part of this program today. I am the Director of MS Navigator Services Delivery with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. I've actually been with the organization for it'll be 20 years this coming March. In my current role, I oversee the provision of services, information, resources, and support to people affected by MS. And I am also the person who kind of oversees and leads the nationwide work to ensure people with MS are connected to the employment benefits and the health insurance information and resources that they are looking for. I started off at our local level about 17 and a half years, where I specifically managed our comprehensive employment and benefit assistance program. And prior to coming to actually the MS study, I worked for the state vocational rehabilitation agency, as well as in a private sector vocational rehabilitation and case management company, where I was providing job development and job placement assistance to people with a physical disability. So really my entire career has been focused on kind of vocational and employment concerns of people with disabilities. So just to kind of go over some of our kind of high-level learning objectives for today's webinar, definitely I'm hopeful that by the end of this webinar, you'll be more familiar with multiple sclerosis. We're going to talk just kind of basic information, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, be able to define the employment issues and concerns that people who are living with MS may experience, recognize and understand the characteristics of specifically the adult-onset conditions, hidden disabilities, the implications that they may have within the workplace, and hopefully to feel more confident knowing the resources that would be available to you in working with your employees who may be living with MS. So just to get us started, kind of want to do some general education about what is MS. So you see here that MS is thought to be a disease of the immune system, so like an autoimmune disease that affects the central nervous system. And again, the CNS is comprised of our brain, spinal cord, and the optic nerves. It's not fatal, it's not contagious, it's not directly inherited, it's not always severely disabling. The kind of the name multiple sclerosis literally means many scars. So really that name is derived from the scarring that's caused by kind of the inflammation that is affecting the myelin sheath or the protective coating that surrounds our nerve fibers. So kind of this picture here kind of represents a nerve, kind of that nerve or the axon, kind of the yellow area is that myelin sheath or that protective coating. Almost if you kind of picture your nerves kind of maybe like an electrical cord that there's that rubber or that plastic coating that surrounds the fiber to allow that electricity, that message to go through smoothly. Within our nerves, that myelin sheath is that protective coating, and that is the insulation that facilitates nerve conduction. Well, with MS, that protective coating, the MS is actually kind of attacking that myelin sheath, the protective coating, causing some inflammation and some scarring, which would then impact the conductivity of those messages, and in some circumstances, the MS may actually directly affect the nerve itself. So what causes MS? This is honestly, I think one of the big challenges with MS is that we're really not 100% certain. What we believe is that people may have a genetic predisposition to being diagnosed to MS, but that there's some sort of an environmental trigger, something within the environment that might trigger that person's the immune system kind of to turn upon itself, and again, to turn upon the myelin sheath. We think that this may be related to some sort of a virus or a bacteria. There's been a lot of actually research studies being done looking at the role that vitamin D plays. So there's a lot of different kind of theories and factors out there, but we're not 100% sure what causes MS. So that can be a challenge. Who gets MS? So the majority of people with MS are diagnosed between the ages of 20 and 50. Again, it can be diagnosed earlier than that. It can be diagnosed later. I've worked with teenagers who were diagnosed. I've worked with people who were diagnosed in their 60s. But when we look kind of across the board, most people are diagnosed between the ages of 20 to 50. And again, from an employment perspective, this is typically in the midst of a person's career. When we talk in a few minutes about kind of the implications in terms of like the adult onset disabilities, oftentimes people in their 20s to 50s have already completed their advanced training and degrees, moving up the career ladder. So there definitely are very specific employment considerations. It's more prevalent in women compared to men. We say about 2 to 3 times more often diagnosed in women compared to men. This is fairly typical for a lot of the other like autoimmune conditions that seem for whatever reason to be more prevalent in women. There's approximately 400,000 people with MS that are in the United States, about 2.3 million people throughout the world. To be honest, roughly 200 people are diagnosed weekly. Multiple sclerosis is more prevalent in the more temperate climates of the world, meaning the farther that we get from the equator, the higher prevalence there is of multiple sclerosis. Again, just one of those kind of interesting facts that might lead us to think that there's some sort of an environmental trigger or environmental factor. More common in those of Northern European ancestry. But again, the reality is that for the most part, you know, anybody in your workplace could be a person who's living with MS, or could be a person who is diagnosed with it. So how is it diagnosed? This, again, is one of those challenges. One of the challenges, not only that we don't know what causes it, but another challenge is that there's not one specific diagnostic procedure that is used. So oftentimes people may be undergoing a variety of different tests, missing time from work. Really, the MS is considered to be a clinical diagnosis based on medical history, as well as getting information about specific symptoms that that person may be experiencing. Typically, neurologists would be the type of healthcare professional that would make that definitive diagnosis. Oftentimes what's going on with MS is that the neurologists are trying to rule out some other conditions. So there must be no other explanation. Let's try to make sure that it's not lupus, or that it's not rheumatoid arthritis, or that it's not Lyme disease, because again, a lot of the symptoms that I'm going to talk about here shortly are common with those other types of conditions too. So there must be no other explanation. Oftentimes a person may be undergoing a variety of different tests, the MRI, spinal taps, blood work, different types of diagnostic procedures. Really, the MRI has proven to be one of the kind of most utilized diagnostic tests done, where we're looking for specific plaques or that scarring in the central nervous system. A person needs to experience multiple symptoms over a period of time. Again, thinking about this in the workplace, this diagnosis process could take time. So an individual may be missing time from work. As they're going through the diagnosis process, they might experience maybe one symptom and return to work and be fine, but then sometime down the road may experience that second symptom, that second neurological symptom that then might lead them to get that definitive MS diagnosis. And again, just the realization that this can be challenging for that person with MS. They can go for long periods of time with these mystery symptoms, and these symptoms may directly impact their productivity and their effectiveness on the job. I include this slide in here just to let you know that there are some general patterns that we see with MS, but I think one of the most important takeaways for today's webinar is that no two people are the same. I oftentimes say that if you've met one person with MS, you've met one person with MS, because no two people are the same in terms of the pattern of their disease, the symptoms that they experience. So you see here 4 general patterns. There's no way of knowing from that initial experience exactly what pattern or what official type of multiple sclerosis that the person has. It's more something that develops over time. So clinically isolated syndrome, that first experience, again, like I said, with a diagnosis, a person needs 2 neurological experiences to get that definitive MS diagnosis. So a person may be diagnosed with clinical isolated syndrome, which means that they might be at risk for developing multiple sclerosis, but they have not yet had that second. The relapsing remitting is the most common form of multiple sclerosis. We say usually about like 85% of people or so. This is the pattern that their disease follows, which experiences periods of marked exacerbations or flare-ups. And then after that exacerbation, they get back to either not experiencing any symptoms at all, or there may be some just residual symptoms. Primary progressive, about 15% of people, this is the pattern that their disease typically follows. Just from the onset, it's more of a steadily worsening of neurological function, so not with those marked flare-ups. And then secondary progressive, for those that start off as the relapsing remitting form, at some point their disease may become more progressive in nature. Again, they may still experience some of those relapses, but it's more of a gradual decline. It's not important necessarily to worry about what form of multiple sclerosis that your employee or your coworker has, but just to know that it can look very different in different people. And you see here also some of the common symptoms. You see here fatigue is probably one of the most common. Vision symptoms is often one of the first symptoms that people with MS may experience. You see it's a bit of a laundry list here: stiffness, spasticity, cognitive changes, mobility challenges, depression, mood swings, bowel, bladder, tingling and numbness, sensitivity to heat or to cold, speech, swallowing, pain, tremor. I think it's important to realize that these symptoms may be experienced by people with other conditions too, which again, going back to that, oftentimes trying to rule things out. but these symptoms may come and go. It would probably be fairly uncommon for a person to experience all of these symptoms, but these symptoms may come and go, again, thinking about the exacerbations, the relapses. Some people may only have one or two of these symptoms. Others may experience more. And also just pay attention to so many of these symptoms don't have any visible symptoms. So fatigue, cognitive changes, some of the emotional changes, bowel and bladder. So just that awareness of oftentimes multiple sclerosis being non-apparent. And we're going to talk about that more here in just a couple minutes. And then last thing just to talk about in terms of kind of general what is MS type of education is just how is it treated? So while there is no cure for multiple sclerosis, we really look at treating MS from a variety of different perspectives. We can treat the exacerbations, again, thinking about the relapsing remitting forms of MS with those exacerbations or the flare-ups. Oftentimes, these flare-ups are treated with intravenous steroids. Not all flare-ups or exacerbations require treatment, but if a person is receiving treatment, that might impact them on the job because they might need to miss some time from work if they're receiving those intravenous steroids. Some people may be able to do those at home. Other people may require the hospitalization from time to time. Slowing the disease progression, I think it's important to realize that though there's no cure, there has been great advances in terms of treating the underlying disease. So there are currently 15 what are called disease-modifying therapies that are approved by the FDA, which have been shown to reduce the severity and the frequency of the disease activities or those flare-ups. Again, we definitely, and this was a very big step for us as an organization, where we really do recommend that people start on a disease-modifying therapy as soon as possible, because the research has really showed that it can slow the progression of the disease over time, therefore hopefully allowing people to stay employed, to stay active, to stay involved in their community. From an employment perspective, again, some of these treatments may have side effects, whether flu-like symptoms. Some are administered through through an infusion. So again, that might involve missing time from work. The other thing to be aware of is that these disease-modifying therapies are fairly costly, which I think also really brings home the importance of people with MS who oftentimes are very concerned about maintaining their medical insurance. And we know that so oftentimes benefits, whether it's health insurance, disability benefits, life insurance, when they are the employer-sponsored benefits, are so key to people to want to try to maintain. And then there are also just symptom management techniques, whether it's medications, things like physical therapy, occupational therapy, that can really do a person great benefit in terms of managing their symptoms to hopefully allow them to continue to work, to stay active, as well as to just kind of maintain their overall quality of life. So switching gears now, hopefully now that you've kind of gained some general information about what MS is and some of the challenges and the characteristics, I want to talk about just how MS can impact a person on the job. So there have been several research studies done throughout the years that show that 90% of people with MS have work. At the time of diagnosis, about 60% are still working. So again, we know that people may separate from the workforce for a variety of different reasons. They might go back to school, they might stop work in order to raise a family, whatever that decision is. But several years down the road, the percentage of people with MS remaining in the workforce drops to about 40 to 43%. I can say that though that percentage seems poor, it is better than previous studies. So we've really been looking at the employment concerns of people with MS throughout the years. Some studies that were done back in the 1980s showed that only about 30 to 33% of people with MS were still employed 5 to 10 years after the diagnosis. But putting that into perspective, the 1980s predated the ADA, which was, again, passed in 1990, and it also predated any of the disease-modifying therapies. For as long as we've had MS in the world, the first treatment was approved by the FDA actually in 1993. So for so many years, people were diagnosed with MS, and there was no medication available to help treat the underlying disease. So we're assuming and we're thinking that part of that gradual increase may be due to better treatment options and more legal protections. But we still have a way to go. And I think that this is where working with employers who are receptive and supportive can only help to increase these types of percentages to allow more people with MS to stay employed. So what we've heard in terms of some of those reasons why people are leaving the workforce. So oftentimes employees with MS may be leaving the workforce prematurely and voluntarily. They don't know what types of accommodation strategies that they could use or that they have the right to ask for. Disclosure is a huge, huge issue, and we're going to be talking about that here shortly. The variability, the unpredictability of the disease, again, that progressive nature, the condition changing over time. So this need to to reevaluate the need for these accommodations, and if these are no longer proving successful or beneficial either to the employee or to the employer, what options, what additional options? They don't know of the available resources, whether it's getting hired or the Job Accommodation Network or the National MS Society or the State Vocational Rehab Agency. They don't know where to turn to help think proactively about their long-term employability. And we definitely know that transportation issues can pose a barrier too. I think here's where I think one of the things that we try to do is to do that education with employees with MS, to let them know more about their legal rights. Like if somebody might not know that they can tap into the Family Medical Leave Act intermittently, or they might not necessarily know that they have the legal right to request an accommodation. They may just prematurely say, you know what, there's no way I can work anymore, and therefore I'm just going to quit. So what is it that we can do to educate employees with MS, to support them, to let them know that they do have rights and that they do have options. The disclosure dilemma, again, we definitely know that there are some people who really don't want anybody to know, so they might just choose to say, you know what, I don't want to go there, I don't want to share with my employer. But again, what is it that we can do to help people feel more comfortable in terms of kind of disclosing and being familiar with their legal protections? Want to just highlight the characteristics of adult-onset disability. So thinking back to what I said, where most people are diagnosed between the ages of 20 to 50. So we find that many times employees with MS have completed their advanced training and degrees, have been working, are moving up the career ladder, and then they get this diagnosis that can pose a challenge in the workplace to them maintaining employment for the long term, or they may be used to working at a certain level and finding it difficult to maintain that pace. And that comes into play too. Oftentimes constituents that I'm working with who are used to working at high-level positions might choose to maybe take a step back. They're used to being a VP and working 70 hours a week, but realizing that they can't do that anymore. So they might choose to take a step back. And so that might be something for employers to question. Well, I see that you were a VP and now you're applying for this job as a manager. Kind of, why is that? They might think that that person is overqualified, or again, that there are just so many different kind of layers that come into play. One constituent that I worked with actually that I think was a really good example of someone who was diagnosed later on in life and had to use their transferability of their skills is somebody that I worked with, and she was actually one of my first constituents that I ever worked with, so I've known her now for almost 20 years, had a kinesiology degree. She was working, you know, as an athletic trainer, so she would be the person who, at those high school football games, if a student got injured, she would be the first person to run out on the field to assess what was wrong, what treatment was needed. Well, she was diagnosed with actually primary progressive MS, and it ultimately became a safety risk. She wasn't able to run out as quickly as she needed to in order to best assist her students. And this was a big adjustment for her. Again, this is what she had been doing for many, many years. And she realized that it wasn't fair to herself or to her students anymore to serve in that capacity. So I spent a lot of time working with her, really looking at her transferability of her skills. She had this degree, she had this, you know, she had this experience, and ultimately she was able to become the office manager of like an orthopedic surgeon's office. This was an orthopedic surgeon who really had a lot of patients who dealt with sports-related injuries. She was familiar with medical terminology, with sports medicine. She had knowledge and skills and experience that were too valuable to waste. And she was able to successfully transition into a less physically demanding position that still allowed her to use her years and years of experience and her knowledge. And again, that to me was just such a success story. You know, and I think just the other thing too, just to kind of put things into a little perspective here too, in terms of adult onset disability, is not just with MS, but definitely the research shows that roughly 1 in 3 of us are going to develop some sort of an adult onset disability. So again, this is a population that kind of any of us can join at any time. And what is it that we would need? What supports would we be looking for from our employers to allow us to continue to work? Also, when I mentioned the symptoms before, just again, to kind of remind everybody, just oftentimes the symptoms that we see with MS may be hidden or maybe non-apparent. So this can cause additional stress to that employee with MS in terms of kind of that "but you look so good" mentality, either by coworkers, by managers, by supervisors. People might feel like that if they're requesting an accommodation that they're getting some sort of preferential treatment. We know that legally speaking, under the ADA, a person doesn't need to disclose unless they request or need some sort of an accommodation, but sometimes people may feel like they're keeping a secret. So they may choose to disclose for the sake of disclosure. And we're going to talk about that here shortly again too. But again, just to remember that these hidden symptoms can cause just as many limitations or challenges on the job as the visible ones, sometimes even more, because there may be that lack of understanding, lack of awareness by coworkers, by supervisors, or think that that person is faking it, or again, that kind of that but you look so good. So again, just to kind of highlight, I know that many of these symptoms you saw on a previous slide, but some of the most common symptoms that we might see that are hidden. So again, fatigue, tingling, and numbness. This happens a lot of times with constituents that I am working with who may have difficulty feeling their fingers or their legs are numb. Cognitive symptoms, whether it's memory difficulties or processing speed or being easily distracted, vision problems, bowel and bladder symptoms, pain. Again, this can really cause significant challenges to people in terms of maintaining their productivity, but to look at the person, you might never know that they're in that type of discomfort. The temperature sensitivity, again, I mentioned before, we usually see this more with heat sensitivity. Some people may also be sensitive to the cold, but sometimes, especially if a person may be exposed to extreme heat, that might cause kind of like a pseudo-exacerbation, a worsening of their symptoms short-term while their body is kind of, their body temperature raised. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office, and we definitely know here the humidity, the heat that comes, and just people have a really hard time struggling with commuting to work on those really hot, humid days. And also just the emotional changes. We definitely see that people with MS may experience a higher rate of depression or other types of mental health issues, whether that's physiologically, what's going on, again, within that central nervous system, where those plaques are forming, or just the emotional adjustment to living with a chronic and unpredictable, oftentimes progressive disease, or a combination of both. But again, these symptoms are real, and these can directly impact a person's productivity, their effectiveness, and these are the types of accommodations that people might need to request some accommodations on. I can say that fatigue and cognitive are probably two of the most commonly cited symptoms that people with MS talk about in terms of posing challenges to them within the workforce, and two of the symptoms that oftentimes might lead a person to leave that workforce, again, prematurely, without tapping into legal protections, without requesting the accommodations. So these are the types of legal protections that your employees with MS or your colleagues with MS may from time to time either need to tap into or want to get educated and informed about, so they're more knowledgeable about what their protections are. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, obviously the ADA, really, you know, that in regard to preventing discrimination. ADA relates directly to disclosure and requesting accommodations. Again, the reasonable accommodations that a person may be able to ask for in order to help them to perform the essential functions of the job. When the ADA was amended back in 2008, again, know that when those final regulations came out in 2009, and there were 13 conditions that were specifically listed as presuming, kind of, if a person's diagnosed with these 13 conditions, they're presumed to meet the definition of a person with a disability. Therefore, they're protected by the ADA. Multiple sclerosis is actually one of those 13. So for the most part, if a person's diagnosed with MS, they would be able to avail themselves of the ADA. Also, obviously, knowing that not all employers are large employers, but if an employer is smaller, that there may also be at that state or local level the anti-discrimination laws that are overseen and enforced by the Fair Employment Practice Agency. The Family and Medical Leave Act, again, job-protected leave, it's leave without pay. I see this fairly often in terms of either people themselves who may be experiencing an exacerbation, or this is a law that would also apply to family members. So if I myself am caring for my spouse who's living with MS, I might need to tap into this law too. And again, just realizing that FMLA doesn't need to be taken all at one time. Again, the federal statute of the 12 weeks, once that person, we deem that they're eligible, they've worked for that employer for the year, you know, the accurate number of employees work for that company. But this is something that it doesn't need to be taken all at once. It can be taken intermittently if someone's receiving therapies or maybe they've exhausted all of their leave and need to take time off for treatment or for therapy, whether it's physical therapy, occupational therapy, this is the type of law or protection that one of your employees may request information about, paperwork about, okay, what do I need to do to tap into the FMLA? Or, again, going back to even the ADA, what is our process in place that we need to go through in order to request a formal accommodation? And then also COBRA, I mentioned this from the perspective of maintaining health insurance is so important for people with MS. I mentioned before the disease modifying therapies, but even just to maintain that insurance, whether your employees are changing jobs or have decided to separate from the workforce due to their condition, progressing to the point that they can no longer work, COBRA might be another legal protection that people might want to get some additional information about and try to figure out what's the process that they should go through in order to avail themselves of those particular protections. So I always want to talk about disclosure to employers because kind of putting ourselves in our shoes of, or in the shoes of our employees, know that these are the types of conversations and decisions that our employees are really grappling with to determine if and when they should disclose. So definitely kind of knowing the relationship that disclosure has to accommodations. Again, under the ADA, in order to request accommodations, they would need to disclose. This is a very personal decision to make. I've worked with constituents who have never disclosed to their employer, and they've worked for their companies, their organizations for 30 years. They've never needed an accommodation. They're not experiencing any symptoms that directly impact their ability to perform the essential functions of their job. So they have chosen not to disclose. But some people may be leaning more towards disclosing. So part of that is really kind of thinking through the pros and the cons. These are kind of decisions that whether your employees choose to or choose not to disclose. Oftentimes these might be some of the reasons behind those sorts of decisions. I think definitely some of the pros to disclosure, again, you see here reducing stress allows you to do, or allows that employee to do the education, obviously allows that person the opportunity to request the accommodations, whether it be now or sometime in the future. Thinking back again to when we were learning about just what MS is, the unpredictability, the variability, the need for the accommodations might change as the person's disease changes, as new or different systems present themselves. So this is not the type of a conversation that's had once and never talked about again. This is a decision, this is a conversation that may need to be revisited from time to time. The person may just generally feel more open to look into their benefits, again, whether it's health insurance, life insurance, long-term care insurance, disability insurance, those sorts of things, and just ultimately may feel more comfortable. I think the ultimate fear that people have, that employees with MS have when it comes to disclosing, is fear of being terminated, fear of being pigeonholed, being overlooked for promotion opportunities. Again, that's why I so enjoy speaking to employers like those that we have on this program today, because you all are hopefully really making a concerted effort to hire people with disabilities and hire people with MS. So you definitely see the value that people with disabilities bring to the workforce. So again, I think that's something that hopefully we can continue to chip away at. I think a few other kind of thoughts when it comes to disclosure that oftentimes people with MS may be grappling with is trying to figure out who is the appropriate person, when is the appropriate time, and what is it that they would actually say. So again, here's where kind of trying to be clear with if a person may need to request some accommodation. That could be a direct supervisor, that could be someone in benefits. I know some employers may have a disability program manager, those types of positions. So this is some of those kind of behind-the-scenes activities that your employees with MS may be trying to determine. The timing of it is very important. You know, I know usually the advice that I give to people is, you know, unless you need some sort of an accommodation for that interview is usually not the best time to disclose for a variety of different reasons. Oftentimes that person who you're interviewing with may be the recruiter and may not ultimately be the right person to even have this information or to know what to do with this information. So that might be a conversation to have with your direct supervisor, or like I said, with someone in benefits. I've worked with some people who might choose to disclose when the offer is made. I've worked with some people who've chosen to disclose maybe after they've been working for a period of time, a few weeks to a couple months, to see, okay, are they experiencing any symptoms that are directly impacting their ability to work, to be productive? So then they would have a sense of what accommodations might I want to request in order to be effective. And then also just the awareness that sometimes that we know that disclosure may be beneficial depending on the type of employer that you are, whether you're a federal government contractor, federal government agency. So definitely we, in the work that I do and the work that we do at, you know, the MS Society, that we really try to educate people about Section 503 and the self-identification form and Schedule A when it comes to federal government positions. So again, obviously this is a very complex decision that people with MS may be grappling with. So I can't talk about disclosure without talking about accommodations. And what I want those of you on this webinar to, I hope they're going to leave with a lot of information, but especially when it comes to accommodations, I'm really hopeful that you can leave with some practical ideas that if an employee with MS comes to you, again, understanding that it's supposed to be an interactive process, hopefully they're going to come with solutions, they're going to come with those sorts of accommodations ideas, but for you to have some ideas too in terms of what might be effective. So again, fatigue, the most common symptom that we see with MS, flexible work hours, combining breaks, taking a rest period, telecommuting. As I'm going through these types of accommodation strategies, I also want you to keep in mind that many of these accommodations don't cost anything. I think we see this across the board in terms of the cost of accommodations, but especially the accommodation strategies for people who are living with MS. Many of these accommodations don't cost a lot or might not cost anything. So even just looking at flexibility in the schedule, cognitive symptoms to eliminate distractions, utilizing day planners, organizing things, staying project focused. I had one person who her desk, she works kind of out in a cubicle environment, and her cube was kind of right in the middle of a main walkway, and people were continuously walking by her, and it was distracting. Again, with that cognitive symptoms, people can be easily distracted. So we were able to, in obviously conjunction with the employer, there was a corner cube that was kind of more tucked away. Nobody was sitting in there, and she was able to request that. She was able to better control her work environment and minimize those types of distractions. Another, I think, kind of practical example of someone that I worked with that was having some pretty severe cognitive symptoms. This is a woman who worked with a small organization here in DC, was experiencing, again, memory challenges. Well, this organization had a habit of having kind of like hallway meetings, kind of getting stopped as you're walking from one office to another, you know, being kind of, you know, asked about projects, getting new assignments, kind of asking about status reports. And by the time that she got back to her desk, she had forgotten the majority of those conversations. So this employer kind of instituted no hallway meetings policy as much as they could, or if those meetings did occur, for whoever initiated that meeting to when they got back to the desk to send an email to summarize what had been discussed, what the next steps were. Even though this started off as an accommodation for this one specific employee, this employer ultimately realized that it really benefited everyone because everyone was being held more accountable and clear about their deadlines and the next steps and all those sorts of things. So again, it's something practical that they were able to put into place, but it actually benefited so many more people than just that one specific employee who was living with MS. The heat sensitivity, again, I've worked with someone just as simple as putting a fan on the person's desk. There are cooling devices, so cooling vests, cooling scarves, things that people can wear to help keep their body temperature low. Again, I mentioned here in DC the heat and the humidity. I've worked with some folks who we have different color codes here. So code red is like the worst of all days when it comes to the air quality and the heat and the humidity. And when it was a code red day, one of the clients that I worked with MS had the ability to work from home. It was just based on the weather. She knew that by the time that she got to work, she would be completely wiped out because of the heat, and just as getting to work activities, she was able to be more productive or just as effective or even more productive by working from home and not having to deal with that. You see here fine motor, so again, maybe difficulty writing, tingling and numbness in the fingertips, looking at, I think here's where using things like assistive technology, different computer access, telephone headsets, again, these are fairly basic things that can make the world of difference. Gross motor, so people who may experience mobility challenges, just making sure that the work site's accessible. If you need to raise a desk to accommodate a person who might use a scooter or a wheelchair due to mobility, whether it's weakness or balance, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to buy a brand new desk. I've worked with some people who stick some cinder blocks or some bricks under the desk just to raise it enough to allow that person to fit under the desk. Again, a practical thing that can make a world of difference. The vision difficulties, again, here's where I think there's so many more built-in accessibility features just to increase the font size. Looking at the lighting, I know fluorescent lighting can be really straining to people's eyes, whether you have MS or not. But especially people with MS, oftentimes we encourage them to have a desk lamp or to look at more task lighting, just on their desk. Bowel and bladder problems, this could be urgency, this could be frequency, just making sure that the workspace is close to the restroom, flexible schedules, home-based, again, these are all, I think, practical things. Speech problems, again, some people may experience some speech challenges, not everybody. This is one of the, I guess, maybe less common symptoms, but again, here's where utilizing assistive technology, computers, email, those sorts of things have just done so much, I think, kind of to level the playing field when it comes to people with disabilities and people with these types of symptoms. And then chronic pain, again, flexible work schedules, taking rest breaks, meditation. Many of these ideas came from the Job Accommodation Network. So I know when we get to the resource slide here and also on the one-pager that you should have received, definitely I would encourage people to just utilize JAN, utilize Getting Hired, utilize the National MS Society as resources to brainstorm additional accommodation ideas. So some of, kind of from my experience, again, working with employers, working with people with, well, working with people with MS for almost 20 years and working with people with disabilities for considerably longer than that, what are some of kind of the things that you can do to help support employees with MS? I think just creating that environment of like openness and support, again, especially in regard to disclosure, the realization that some people may disclose for just for the disclosure's sake, just to kind of open that door, just in case they need something, that can really go far. The realization that variability of symptoms may require the accommodations to change from time to time. It would be okay to maybe do a trial run on an accommodation. Okay, let's maybe try this out for 6 months, and then we can both reevaluate it. Does this work for you, the employee, but does it also work for us, the employer? The importance of confidentiality, again, I think this is so important, especially for people who don't have any visible symptoms. Just if that person's receiving an accommodation that others may notice, how is that going to be addressed? What information can be told, should be told, and I would say whatever you can do to enlist that employee with MS in those sorts of decisions. You know, I've done trainings, just like I'm doing trainings today with this, you know, to you all. You know, I've done, you know, kind of in-service training specific to MS to specific employers who are just wanting to make sure that, you know, all of their staff is more knowledgeable and informed and supportive of their colleagues who may be living with MS. Be open to questions. This is, again, we specifically kind of mentioned the employer-sponsored benefits, things like the Family Medical Leave Act, disability, but also if people may be asking questions about, you know, how do I request an accommodation? There's most likely a reason for that because they're probably at that point that they might realize that they are needing some, you know, some accommodation. I've seen more and more employers, I would say especially within the past few years, really looking at that centralized accommodations fund. So that way then if there are accommodations that cost money, that it's not coming out of one particular department budget. And then just the employee resource groups. I've seen these be really useful just to give people a voice, to give your the employees with disabilities or the employees with MS just a voice and a say in terms of just what's providing assistance, guidance, resources, suggestions back to the employer. We highlight, again, just some of the most important resources. We at the National MS Society have a variety of different employment-related publications. You see here ones that deal with reasonable accommodations. We have specific information for actually the employer community. Our general website, nationalmssociety.org. Again, I've mentioned Jan before. Here's their specific website that gives people ideas in terms of how to accommodate multiple sclerosis specifically. Obviously, the AD/AIDS National Network as well. And also the MSID, we do have a short video, I think it's about 11 or 12 minutes, that's really geared towards the employer. So if you want to learn more about beyond what we've gone over today, please feel free. It's posted on the National MS Society's YouTube page. Obviously, just to clarify what we do here at the National MS Society, we do have actually local offices across the country. Our toll-free number is 1-800-344-4867. The MS Navigator is the program that I mentioned that I'm one of the directors about, again, really connecting people affected by MS to the information, the resources, the support that they need to live their best lives. So whether it's referrals to doctors, referrals to self-help groups, talking through disclosure. Again, we have actually, I work as part of a specialized team of navigators who focus in on benefits, employment, and insurance-related issues. We do have self-help groups. We offer different types of workshops and teleconferences, physical health and exercise programs, oftentimes within the community advocacy efforts. We are always working on both our federal, state, and local legislative priorities. We have different sorts of publications, and we are a nonprofit, so we also have fundraising events, and this is where also we have seen corporations get involved, not only hopefully doing things to increase employing people with MS within those companies, but getting a corporate team together to participate in our walk or our bike. So there are those sorts of opportunities too. Takeaways, I know we're hopefully got a few more minutes for questions here, but again, just don't forget, with MS, it's variable, it's unpredictable, it's different for every person. The importance of realizing that MS is considered to be one of the adult onset disabilities. So again, professional experience, moving up the career ladder, importance of hidden disabilities, disclosure, accommodations can really prove beneficial, and ultimately success. Success is possible. I have seen it. I hope that you all have seen it, and that you will genuinely, if you don't have people with MS working for you already, that you will consider bringing them on and to really find those the success stories, because success is definitely possible. So I know we have about 5 minutes left for questions, Sarah. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was a lot of really great information, and I wanted to highlight a couple key things that you said and just ask a couple questions back. So it might just summarize some of what you've already said, but when you're talking about and asking employers, I think we all are, to hopefully hire more individuals with MS or to bring more people with MS into the workplace. How else can you interpret that? It's a non-apparent disability where you may not be able to see those types of symptoms, but I know for us, when Getting Hired is talking to our employers, one way that we say you can bring on more individuals with non-apparent disabilities like MS is to really just highlight and promote that disability brand that you have, just talking about participating in educational events like today's, or talking about maybe a successful story like an accommodation you provided in the workplace or something else like that. But is there anything else that comes to mind when you hear that or say that you would suggest can help employers achieve that?
I mean, I definitely kind of, as I'm coaching job seekers with MS in terms of what sort of kind of outward appearance does this employer give that they are disability friendly? Are they posting their jobs? Are they recruiting through Getting Hired? Is their like disability initiative or their diversity initiative clearly stated on their website? If there are pictures on the website, does it represent people with disabilities? Again, knowing that even though MS oftentimes might not be visible, I think if potential employees see people with disabilities represented in this company, hopefully that's going to increase their confidence in wanting to work for that company. I can honestly say I work with a lot of people with MS that are looking for work, and they're looking for those disability-friendly employers. So we refer to Getting Hired. We encourage people to look at what sorts of diversity and disability initiatives those employers are putting out there. So I just really think that kind of raising that public awareness goes very, very far, very far.
No, that's really great. And I think to the point of some of the content you mentioned earlier presented, in addition to some of those branding items that you mentioned, even the accommodations as well, without even realizing that they're accommodations. But if you have benefits listed already and proactively, like flexible work schedules and telecommuting, things like that, I think that takes a lot of the guesswork out for the job seekers as well, and that's perspective that we really appreciate from you, just working directly with so many different job seekers, because we don't always get that perspective being on the employing side or the employer side.
I'm actually kind of dealing with the situation now with somebody who wants to work at home, and it turns out that their employer has a formal flexible work arrangement policy. So in this situation, she's actually just asking for what any other for whatever any other employee can ask for to work from home 2 days a week. But in her situation, she's so she's so much more I think cognizant that this is really going to help her to maintain her employment and to work as effectively as she can. And it's those sorts of things that, again, that was very attractive to her, that she realized that there was a policy that there was already a policy in place here. So.
Sure. Yeah, and we're actually at time. So, Steve, if there are any other questions, I'll be sure to send those to you directly and then get back to whoever did ask that question. Again, I just want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar. For those of you attending who are current employer partners of Getting Hired, if you have any other questions about some of the things that we mentioned just in terms of increasing that disability brand that your organization has, further attracting job seekers with all disabilities and non-apparent disabilities, including MS, please let us know. That's really what we're here to work with you on, is to help attract, and a lot of what Steve said, also retain employees that you have in your current workplace with disabilities too. So Steve, I wanted to thank you again for everything, and thank everybody on the line for joining today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
All right, thank you all. Have a great day.